When a homeless man approached Barron Trump asking for just $1, no one expected what would happen next. What started as a simple act of kindness would spark a national movement, reunite a broken family, and change lives forever. The city's heartbeat was relentless. Cars honked, pedestrians weaved through the streets, and the hum of conversations filled the air. On the corner of Broad Street and 17th Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, a man sat slumped against the wall of an old convenience store. His clothes were worn layers that barely kept the biting winter wind at bay. Beside him, a cardboard sign read, "Anything helps. God bless." His name was Leonard, though most people didn't care to know it. At 42, he had been living on the streets for nearly a year, a series of misfortunes stripping him of everything he once held dear. Each day was a gamble. Sometimes a passerby would toss a few coins his way, but more often they hurried past, avoiding his eyes. Leonard adjusted his beanie and shivered. He watched as shoes of every kind passed him. High heels, sneakers, polished loafers. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something different. A pair of pristine white sneakers stopped just feet away from him. They weren't just expensive. They were the kind only someone truly young and privileged would wear. Leonard glanced up, his curiosity piqued. Standing there was a teenager, tall and unmistakably composed, with his hands tucked casually into the pockets of a sleek jacket. Leonard squinted against the sunlight. He recognized the face but couldn't immediately place it. The boy was waiting at the corner, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the attention he was drawing. People around whispered. Some even pulled out their phones discreetly to snap pictures. Leonard hesitated. He wasn't one to approach anyone unless they made eye contact first. But something about the boy's demeanor struck him. He wasn't in a rush like everyone else. There was an air of quiet observation, a calmness that seemed out of place amidst the city's chaos. Taking a breath, Leonard spoke up, his voice dry from the cold. "Hey, young man," he called, forcing a smile. "Can you spare $1?" The boy froze mid-scroll, his head tilting slightly as if to confirm he'd heard correctly. Slowly, he turned to face Leonard, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the world around them seemed to slow down. Leonard braced himself for rejection. He was used to it. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. "What do you need it for?" the boy asked, his voice calm but firm. The question caught Leonard off guard. It wasn't rude or dismissive, but there was a weight to it, as if the boy genuinely wanted to know. Leonard's throat tightened. He hadn't expected a conversation. "Well," he began, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "A cup of coffee would be nice. Maybe a sandwich if I'm lucky." His voice faltered. There was something unsettling about being questioned, but there was no malice in the boy's tone, just curiosity. The boy stepped closer, his phone now forgotten in his pocket. Leonard could feel the stares of others, the silent judgment of people wondering why someone like this kid would waste his time on a man like him. Leonard wanted to shrink away, to avoid the embarrassment, but the boy's gaze held him there. "What's your name?" the boy asked. "Leonard," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded slightly, his brow furrowing as if he were processing something far beyond the moment. "I'm Barron," he said simply. There was no arrogance, no sense of self-importance in his introduction, just an unexpected sincerity. The hum of the city returned, but something in that exchange was different. The air between them felt charged, as if this brief moment would lead to something far greater. Leonard shifted uneasily on the cold pavement, unsure how to respond. Barron's presence was unlike anything he had encountered before. Most people ignored him, averted their gaze, or tossed loose change in his direction without so much as a word. But here was this young man, not just stopping but actually talking to him. as if he were an equal. Barron crouched down to meet Leonard at eye level. The move startled Leonard. No one had ever done that before. "How long have you been out here?" Barron asked, his tone calm but direct. Leonard hesitated. Sharing his story wasn't something he usually did. People didn't care about the why, only the spectacle of his misfortune. But there was something disarming about Barron's demeanor. "Almost a year now," Leonard admitted. "Lost my job after the plant shut down. Then my health took a turn. Couldn't keep up with rent." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "It's been downhill ever since." Barron listened intently, his eyes narrowing slightly, not out of judgment, but focus. It was a look Leonard wasn't used to, a mix of curiosity and concern, as if the teenager were piecing together a puzzle in his mind. Leonard noticed the quiet tension growing among the crowd around them. People were watching, whispering. Some even paused, their curiosity piqued by the unusual sight of the young Trump heir crouched on the sidewalk beside a homeless man. "What about family?" Barron asked. Leonard's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "Don't have much of that anymore. My folks passed years ago. My brother... Well, we haven't talked in ages." He chuckled bitterly. "Not much left to lose when you've already lost it all." Barron was quiet for a moment, as if weighing Leonard's words carefully. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket. Leonard's pulse quickened. He had asked for $1, just one, but Barron's movements suggested something different. When his hand emerged, he wasn't holding a single bill, but a crisp $100 note. The sight made Leonard blink in disbelief. "Here," Barron said, extending the bill toward him. "This should cover more than coffee." Leonard stared at the money, stunned. For a moment he couldn't move. It wasn't just the amount. It was the gesture itself. "Are you serious?" Leonard finally managed to ask, his voice cracking. "Why would you do that?" Barron shrugged lightly. "Because I can." The simplicity of his answer left Leonard speechless. But before he could respond, Barron leaned in a little closer. "But listen," he added, his voice dropping to a softer tone. "This isn't just about the money. I want you to promise me something." "What's that?" Leonard asked, gripping the bill like it might vanish. Barron's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "If I help you today, you've got to help yourself tomorrow. Deal?" Leonard felt a lump rise in his throat. The words hit harder than he expected. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone wasn't just handing him a lifeline. They were challenging him to climb out of the hole he'd fallen into. Leonard nodded, unable to find the right words. "Good," Barron said, standing back up. He glanced around at the gathering crowd, his calm demeanor unshaken by the attention. Leonard felt his cheeks burn as he noticed people recording the interaction on their phones. He wasn't sure how to feel. Grateful? Embarrassed? Or both? Barron reached into his pocket again, pulling out a pen and a small notepad. Scribbling something quickly, he handed the torn piece of paper to Leonard. "Go to this address tomorrow morning. They'll help you out. Tell them Barron sent you." Leonard unfolded the note, his hands trembling slightly. It was the address of a local shelter and resource center, one he'd heard of but had always been too proud or too ashamed to visit. "I'll make sure they're expecting you," Barron added, his voice unwavering. The air around them seemed to shift as Leonard clutched the paper and the money. It wasn't just kindness. It was hope, a fragile, flickering light in a world that had long been dark. And somehow, Leonard knew this was only the beginning. Leonard sat there, staring at the $100 bill and the note in his hands, as if they were alien objects. His mind raced, caught between disbelief and cautious hope. Barron didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stood there, watching Leonard with an intensity that felt almost unnerving. It was clear he wasn't just offering a handout. He was waiting for something, perhaps an acknowledgement or a commitment. Leonard cleared his throat, his voice shaky. Why? Why do you care? You don't know me. Barron tilted his head slightly, his lips forming a faint smile. Because everyone has a story, Leonard. Yours just hasn't been told yet. He paused, glancing at the crowd beginning to gather. And honestly, if I'm in a position to do something good, why wouldn't I? Leonard was taken aback. He'd heard plenty of empty words over the years, but Barron's tone carried a weight that felt genuine. Still, skepticism gnawed at him. You don't owe me anything, Leonard said, his voice firmer now. I've been out here long enough to know people don't just stop to help without expecting something in return. Barron crouched down again, leveling his gaze with Leonard's. I don't expect anything, but I do believe that small actions can lead to something bigger. He gestured to the note in Leonard's hand. That place, they've got resources, job programs, counseling, whatever you might need. All I'm asking is that you show up. Leonard swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. He glanced at the note again, the address scribbled in neat handwriting. He wanted to believe this was real, but years of disappointment had hardened him. And what if I can't do it? What if I screw it up? Barron smiled faintly, shaking his head. Everyone screws up, Leonard. But giving up, that's the only way you lose. His words were simple, but they landed with a force Leonard wasn't prepared for. For a moment, the noise of the city seemed to fade, and all he could hear was the quiet conviction in the teenager's voice. The crowd around them had grown thicker, and phones were now openly pointed in their direction. Someone murmured, "Is that Barron Trump?" Leonard glanced nervously at the growing attention. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the weight of so many eyes on him felt suffocating. Barron seemed unfazed. If anything, he seemed to thrive under the pressure, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Leonard's unease. "Ignore them," Barron said softly, as if reading Leonard's mind. "This is about you and me right now. No one else matters." Leonard felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. Someone saw him, really saw him, and cared enough to listen. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll go. I'll show up." Barron's expression softened, a genuine smile breaking through. "That's all I wanted to hear." He stood up, brushing off his knees and glancing at the crowd. "And Leonard," he added, his voice louder now, as if speaking for everyone to hear, "you've got more strength in you than you realize. Don't forget that." Leonard blinked, overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, clutching the note tightly in his hand like a lifeline. As Barron turned to leave, the crowd parted for him, their whispers growing louder. Leonard watched him disappear into the city, his figure blending into the stream of people. For the first time in years, Leonard felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost: hope. And as he looked at the note again, he realized this was the first step toward reclaiming his life. The next morning, Leonard stood outside the address Barron had given him. It was a modest brick building on a quieter side of Cleveland, its entrance marked with a simple sign, Hope Outreach Resource Center. A small stream of people filtered in and out, some carrying grocery bags, others looking as uncertain as Leonard felt. He clutched the note in his pocket, his fingers tracing the edges as if to remind himself this wasn't a dream. The $100 bill was still tucked safely in his jacket. Part of him wanted to save it, to hold on to the generosity as proof that yesterday had really happened. But another part, the part of him that Barron's words had stirred, whispered that it wasn't just about the money. It was about the chance to start over. Taking a deep breath, Leonard stepped inside. The warmth of the building enveloped him immediately, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile, looked up from her desk. "How can I help you today?" Leonard hesitated before pulling out the note and sliding it across the counter. Barron sent me, said I should come here." Her eyes flicked to the paper, and a knowing smile spread across her face. "Ah, you must be Leonard. We've been expecting you." She stood, motioning for him to follow. "Come on, let's get you started." The next few hours passed in a blur. Leonard met with a caseworker who listened to his story without judgment, outlining a plan to get him back on his feet. They set him up with a temporary bed in their shelter, arranged for a doctor's appointment to address his health issues, and even connected him with a job training program. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in years, Leonard felt like the pieces of his life were being picked up and carefully put back together. Later that evening, as he sat on the edge of his cot in the shelter, Leonard replayed the events of the past 24 hours in his mind. The kindness of a stranger, the offer of help, the simple act of being seen. It all felt surreal. He thought about Barron's words, about the promise he had made to help himself. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, Leonard believed it was possible. Meanwhile, outside the shelter, Barron's gesture had begun to ripple far beyond what either of them could have imagined. A video of their interaction, taken by a bystander, had gone viral overnight. It spread across social media like wildfire, with headlines praising the young Trump heir's unexpected act of generosity. The footage showed Barron kneeling beside Leonard, handing him the money, and speaking words of encouragement that had struck a chord with millions. Some called it a publicity stunt, while others argued it was a rare display of genuine compassion from someone in a position of privilege. Regardless of the debates, one thing was clear. The video had captured something raw and powerful. People from all walks of life began reaching out to Hope Outreach Resource Center, offering donations and support inspired by Barron's actions. Leonard had no idea his story was now at the center of a national conversation. He was too busy focusing on the steps ahead, attending his first counseling session, filling out job applications, and learning to believe in himself again. As Leonard lay down that night, the weight of the past year seemed a little lighter. Somewhere out there, the young man who had stopped to help him was making waves. But Leonard's focus was simple. Take it one day at a time and honor the promise he'd made. By the end of the week, Leonard began to notice subtle changes, both within himself and in the world around him. At the shelter, staff members treated him with a kindness he hadn't felt in years. They offered not just practical support, but also encouragement, reminding him that his story wasn't over yet. Word of his journey had spread quietly within the shelter community. Others who had been struggling in silence came up to him, inspired by his willingness to take the first step. "If you can do it, maybe I can too," one man had said, giving Leonard a pat on the back. The gesture, simple as it was, filled Leonard with an unfamiliar sense of pride. Outside the shelter, however, Leonard's story was no longer quiet. The video of his interaction with Barron Trump had exploded across social media, racking up millions of views in just a few days. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every detail. Commentators debated whether Barron's actions were genuine or performative, while viewers around the country shared their thoughts online. "Privilege with a purpose," one tweet read. "This is how you use it for good." Another user posted, "It's sad that kindness like this is so rare it shocks us. But kudos to Barron for showing us it's possible." Leonard learned about the attention when a staff member at the shelter showed him the video. Watching himself on screen, Leonard felt a strange mix of emotions. Embarrassment, gratitude, and something he couldn't quite name. He barely recognized the man in the video, the hollow eyes, the defeated posture. It was a reminder of how far he'd fallen, and perhaps how far he could rise. Meanwhile, Barron stayed silent about the growing buzz. He refused interviews, avoided public statements, and ignored the online noise. To him, this wasn't about basking in praise, it was about Leonard. Behind the scenes, Barron quietly ensured that the shelter received substantial donations, enough to expand its programs and help even more people like Leonard. The video sparked a larger movement. People across the country began sharing their own acts of kindness, tagging them with hashtags like #KindnessChallenge and #PayItForward. Local organizations reported increases in donations, and volunteers stepped forward in droves, inspired by the simplicity of Barron's gesture. For Leonard, the ripple effect became more personal. One evening, as he sat in the shelter's common room, he was approached by a man who looked oddly familiar. "Leonard?" the man asked hesitantly. Leonard squinted, trying to place the face. Then it clicked. "Paul?" he said, his voice trembling. It was his younger brother, the one he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The two men stared at each other, the weight of lost years hanging between them. "I saw the video," Paul admitted, sitting down beside him. I didn't know things had gotten so bad for you. I should have reached out sooner." Leonard shook his head, fighting back tears. "It's not your fault. I didn't exactly make it easy for anyone to find me." Paul placed a hand on Leonard's shoulder. "Well, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The reunion was bittersweet, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of what could still be rebuilt. For Leonard, it was another step toward healing, not just his circumstances, but his relationships and his sense of self. As the weeks went on, Leonard began to see his story less as a tragedy and more as a testament to resilience. And though he still had a long road ahead, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, fueled by the kindness of a stranger who had given him more than money. He had given him hope,